And now please join me in welcoming Danny Collins to the stage.
Coral reefs are one of the most productive, diverse ecosystems on the planet that are known for their beautiful, amazing colors. But a fun fact is that corals actually have no color at all. The color instead is from colorful microscopic algae that are living in the coral's tissues called symbionts. And these symbionts, through photosynthesis, provide a vast majority of the coral's nutrients. The coral and the symbionts work together. The coral provides the housing, and the symbionts provide the food. And this relationship is the bedrock for why these ecosystems can be so productive. However, this important relationship is deteriorating due to changing ocean conditions, largely from increasing water temperatures. And as the water gets too warm, these symbionts begin to lose their function and start to produce toxins that the coral does not like. And as these toxins build up in the coral's tissues over time, at a certain point, the coral then has enough and kicks out and expels the symbionts from its tissues. And without symbionts, the corals lose their color, turn white, starve, and die. And this is referred to as coral bleaching. Corals all over the world are turning white and dying. It is one of the largest ecological disasters facing our planet today. And there's an urgent need to try to solve coral bleaching. And there's amazing research all over the world with groups trying to address this problem, with research efforts towards making the corals more heat tolerant, trying to make the symbionts more heat tolerant, trying to prevent the symbionts from producing toxins, trying to prevent the coral from expelling the symbionts. However, all these efforts are preventative. They're trying to prevent a healthy coral from bleaching. But what there's little attention on is, once a coral has bleached, what can you do? Largely because most people actually treat bleached corals as dead. But they're not dead. Bleached corals are not actually, they're actually still alive. While they are dying, they are not dead yet. And with this knowledge, with my supervisors, Fearens McKelly and Steve Palumbi, we got together and wanted to discuss, were there ways we could explore recovering corals that have already bleached? And as I mentioned, all that a bleached coral is missing is healthy symbionts. And so we began discussing what were ways we could reintroduce these symbionts back to bleached corals. And what better reservoir for a bunch of healthy symbionts than healthy coral itself? And that led us to then ask a simple question. Could we use healthy corals to actually recover bleached corals? To explore that, we set up a simple experiment. What happens if you put a healthy coral in contact with a bleached coral? Shown here at week 0 at the beginning of our experiment, on the left is a bleached white coral in contact with a healthy brown coral. And after 9 weeks of contact between the healthy coral and the bleached coral, what we found were stunning results. The healthy coral completely recovered the bleached coral. The healthy coral actually sent over these symbionts, recovering the bleached coral, restoring it back to health, such that by the end of 9 weeks, the healthy coral and the bleached coral were indistinguishable from each other. And this is the first demonstration showing that a bleached coral can be recovered through just contact with healthy corals. What we then wanted to know was, how important was contact for the recovery effect? To explore that, we then set up another simple experiment. What happens if you put a healthy coral in just proximity to a bleached coral? Shown here at week 0 again is a bleached white coral, now just 5 millimeters from a healthy brown coral. And after 9 weeks of the bleached coral being just 5 millimeters from the healthy coral, what we found was not recovery, but death. The bleached coral died. These colors here are not recovery, it actually is black necrotic tissue. While there was some recovery at the top of the fragment, ultimately the coral died. And this death of a bleached coral is what is seen in the field, causing people to treat bleached corals as dead. And when this bleached coral was not in contact with the healthy coral, it too did die. But just to show it again, through contact, we can recover these bleached corals. Thus, contact is key for this recovery effect. And shown here is 9 weeks of contact, resulting in complete recovery. Our next question was, did we need 9 weeks? Could we get complete recovery in less contact time? And as it turns out, yes, we could achieve complete recovery in much less contact time than 9 weeks. To show here, we've got 2 examples of a healthy coral and a bleached coral that were in contact for just 1 week. And after 1 week, we then separated the healthy coral from the bleached coral. But in that 1 week of contact time, the healthy coral actually sent over enough symbionts over to the bleached coral such that the bleached coral could then recover itself. And by the end of 9 weeks, these bleached corals were also still indistinguishable from the healthy corals. And so from this, we've shown we can recover bleached corals through contact with healthy corals, and we can achieve it in just 1 week of contact time. But what we still did not know was how was the healthy coral actually sending over symbionts over to the bleached coral, leading to this recovery. What we found was when we separated the healthy coral from the bleached coral, they actually were ripping. Their tissues were ripping at the seams. Shown here is an image of a bleached coral that was in contact for a healthy coral for 3 weeks. And after 3 weeks, when we separated them, they ripped right where they were in contact. And as it turns out, what was happening here is actually really odd biology. But the healthy coral and the bleached coral were fusing together. Their tissues were fusing. They were creating nutrient highways between themselves, allowing the healthy coral to send over symbionts through these pathways over to the bleached coral, leading to recovery. And so through this, we've shown we can recover bleached corals through just contact with healthy corals, which is a glimmer of hope for coral reefs. And we hope these experiments inspire a new set of interventions, not only focused on prevention, but also centered around recovering corals that have already bleached. And as it turns out, all that a bleached coral needs to recover is just a little help from some healthy corals. Thank you. And now please welcome back to the stage, Halleh Balch.
Thank you. Great. Thank you so much. That was amazing, right? Awesome. Okay, so to take us back a little, imagine you're looking down on Earth from outer space. Everything you see here in green are microscopic marine organisms. They produce half the oxygen we breathe. They sequester more carbon dioxide than all of the rainforests on Earth combined. And they form a key part of our carbon cycle. And our ability to understand their dynamics, their intensity over space and time at a planetary scale is key to our understanding of our climate today and our ability to predict the climate in the future. And new technologies that enable us to study these dynamics are fundamentally changing our understanding of life on Earth. A great example of this is satellite imagery and the new cameras on satellites that have the sensitivity to capture the difference in the reflection of sunlight over a healthy coral reef compared to a bleached coral reef from outer space. And these cameras are completely changing our understanding of the rate and scope of coral reef bleaching worldwide. But it remains extremely challenging to correlate this remote sensing data with the local physical, chemical, and biological indicators that drive them. And there are a couple of reasons why this is. One is when you think about how we make measurements in the lab, right? We like to change variables. We like to apply voltage, modify temperature, pressure, or we like to change chemical or biological variables through gene editing or fluorescent labels. And this is very hard to extend into remote and often extreme ecosystems. Another reason is when researchers make these measurements today, we get on ships. We go out to sea. We collect bottles of water. We bring them back on the boat and then back to land into laboratories that have these complex analytical tools in order to make these measurements. And these tools are both challenging to bring into those environments themselves, as well as require great capital investment, long lead times, and sample preparation. And so this loses really invaluable environmental context. So what we'd like to be able to do is be a little bit more like Ansel Adams. What if we could bring our measurements into the native environment itself? So my research group is working to close this gap with nanophotonics, sensors that connect light and chemistry in order to make new measurements. So how does this really work? If you imagine a camera and the lenses inside, you might think of the big glass pieces with curved surfaces, where the curvature allows us to focus light. In nanophotonics, we use the structure of materials at dimensions smaller than the wavelength of light in order to control how light scatters. And in doing so, we can create flat lenses, microscopic mirrors, filters, and polarizers, effectively all different optical elements that you might be familiar with. This is actually the same underlying physics as in structural color, where that blue iridescence that you might be familiar with from beetles' wings or butterfly wings, it's actually not pigment. It's the scattering of light from these nanoscale structures. And so we use these same principles in our work, but with rational engineering control. And in particular, I want to tell you about a set of nanophotonic optical antennae that we're designing that trap specific colors of light, and it allows us to use these antennas as nanoscale molecular sensors, where the color of light trapped in the antenna will shift when molecules bind. We can use scalable silicon manufacturing techniques in order to develop these nanoscale optical antennae. Each antenna is about 1/10 of the width of your hair. We can pattern hundreds or thousands of these antennae on a single centimeter square. And based on the underlying physics that we design into it, we can actually use imaging and image analysis techniques to read out from hundreds or thousands of sensing elements simultaneously. And this is a particularly exciting time to be doing this work, because if you think about the transformation from vacuum tube computing to modern integrated circuits, we're at a similar inflection point today in photonic integrated circuits, where we're able to scale the fabrication and deployment of these systems. And you can see nanophotonics all around us today, from AR and VR to LiDAR and imaging. All of these techniques and tools use nanophotonics to achieve their goals. This, combined with wireless communications through the mass array of satellites today, is making it possible for us to get data back out from remote and disparate regions. So we use these same approaches to make lightweight, compact, and deployable devices for the environment. And we're able to design and prototype these platforms right here at Stanford using the computational facilities and the Stanford nanofabrication facilities. And then we're able to prototype and deploy these right here in Stanford's Hopkins Marine Station in Monterey Bay, which is an amazing ecosystem to allow this kind of end-to-end rapid prototyping and development. So what do we want to use this for, right? We are interested in studying life. So the oceans are the largest habitat on the planet, not only by area, but by volume, okay? So what if we could do an ocean census? But if you think about what it would take to do that, you really have to get down to looking at the molecules of life, looking at the DNA and the RNA. And in order to get at that, we can use some of the new tools. So environmental DNA is an emerging tool for biodiversity monitoring. You can sequence DNA from water samples, and researchers have shown that through these sequences, you can actually recapitulate nearly all of the species seen in observational surveys, and often hundreds or thousands of additional ones. And this has completely changed the rate and scope of biodiversity monitoring across ecosystems on Earth. However, these techniques today currently use very specialized sequencing facilities and often have long lead times, which restrict management practices and response. So we're developing our nanophotonic platform in order to do multi-species environmental DNA detection, where different species can be directly detected on our nanophotonic antenna array, and we can read these out as a function of time from water samples. We work very closely with users, both water resource managers as well as fishers, through a collaboration through the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions and the Palau International Coral Reef Center, in order to identify what the engineering constraints are from the very earliest stages of our work. We're also using this platform to connect ocean chemistry back to satellite data. So if we think back to the start, all of those green photosynthetic microbes, under some conditions, they can produce these rapid population expansion, which can undergo and are sometimes called harmful algae blooms. And the challenge is that from satellite, we can see these blooms, but we can't tell what species are present, nor whether they are producing toxins. So using our platform, we can actually measure the molecules in the water, both the genes and the toxins on the same platform. We can do this at sub-picomolar quantitative levels. We can reuse this system for weeks in the field using field-tested chemistries. And we're able to automate both the sample processing as well as the onboard image analysis. So how do we actually go below? How do we deploy? We're working with incredible roboticists, and there's been a huge rise in marine robotics, spanning floats to autonomous underwater vehicles and moorings that allow you to both float across vast ocean currents as well as adaptively track. You can then send data via all those satellites back to land. And we're working with NOAA and the Oceanographic Research Station MBARI in order to integrate our platforms on board these underwater vehicles in order to really scale these in situ measurements over space and time. And our vision is really to connect these deployable in situ sensors of chemical data with the global satellite coverage. This can enable early warning systems of water contamination, to adaptive biodiversity surveys, to really starting to even ask questions of the novel chemistry produced by life under extreme conditions. And what's really exciting about this is that this world is literally where we are today. We have hyperspectral satellites, we have autonomous vehicles, we have new analytical sensors all coming together. And it's a really exciting time to be doing this work. And I want to thank you for your time and all of my supporters and collaborators.